Eala is out of Cincinnati, and on paper, that should not change very much. This is a WTA 1 to 1,000 event, with major names still in the draw, established stars still competing, and plenty of matches that would normally give tennis fans a reason to stay tuned. The tournament has not lost its biggest names, and Cincinnati certainly has not stopped being Cincinnati. But something feels different about the place now that she's gone. Before her exit, people weren't scrolling the schedule looking for whichever match sounded interesting. They were looking for her, specifically. What time she played, which court, whether there was any way left to get inside once her match got announced. Around her matches, Philippine flags showed up in the stands by the dozens, supporters clustered in groups you could spot from across the grounds, and the whole atmosphere took on a shape that was hard to mistake for an ordinary tour stop. Then, almost overnight, that shifted. By the time she walked out for her third-round match, the one that decided whether she stayed in the tournament, the crowd wasn't empty. It just wasn't what it had been all week. Fewer flags. Quieter corners where the chants used to roll through non-stop. Even her opponent picked up on it. She mentioned it afterward, almost in passing, the way you'd mention the weather, something about not seeing quite as many of Alex's fans out there that particular night. Maybe it was the hour, maybe it wasn't. Small detail. Shouldn't really matter. A match doesn't need a packed house to count as real. But it stuck with people who'd been following this story all summer, because for months, a quiet crowd simply hadn't been part of the picture. So before getting into what actually happened on court, it's worth pausing on what exactly went missing. Whatever this thing is that built up around her, city after city, none of it happened by accident. And it helps to know how big it had already gotten before anyone starts guessing why it looked smaller. Rewind to the weekend right before that loss. Cincinnati posted its highest attendance numbers in tournament history. Not close to a record, the actual record. The tournament director didn't dance around the reason either. He said, flat out, he hadn't seen anything like it before in women's tennis, and he wasn't talking about the level of play on court. Toronto had already given a preview of this a few weeks earlier, when her second-round match sold out within hours of the schedule going up. Food vendors at the grounds had started adjusting their menus by then, because enough of the crowd wanted something closer to home. Not the kind of thing that happens by coincidence. That's a venue reacting in real time to a shift in who's actually walking through the gates. It wasn't only the marquee stops, either. Weeks earlier, at a smaller event in Austria, she'd walked out braced for the usual polite, half-filled stands you get in a country you've barely played in. Instead, rows of people had traveled just to be there. Talking about it afterward, she sounded genuinely surprised, like the scale of it hadn't fully caught up with her yet. Every stop told a version of the same story. Stadiums that normally feel hushed and reserved turned into something closer to a home game. People weren't just watching tennis, they were showing up for one player, in numbers large enough that tournaments were rearranging logistics around a single name on the draw sheet. Which is exactly why that quieter night in the third round landed the way it did. If this was really as big as everyone kept saying, why did it feel smaller right when she needed it most? If you were part of that crowd anywhere this summer, Austria, Toronto, Cincinnati drop, where you watched her play below. Because what comes next depends on whether this thing traveled with her or got left behind in those stadiums. 2 nights before that quieter crowd, the same tournament looked completely different. Alex was on court against a Romanian player named Rus, and the place was still loud, flags out, chants rolling, the same energy that had chased her through Toronto weeks earlier. She broke serve early, ran off 6 straight games, and had the match well in hand by the time a weather delay hit. When play resumed, Ruse couldn't continue, and Alex advanced 6-1, 3-love. Simple night. The crowd got what it came for and stayed loud from start to finish. So whatever changed, it didn't happen there. It happened 2 days later. Her third-round match, against Amanda Anisimova, opened the same way. She took the first set 6-4, playing the kind of aggressive, flat-hitting tennis that had given bigger names trouble all summer. The second set flipped on her. She was up early, 3-2, before Anisimova clawed level and pulled the match into a decider. One stretch in that final set explains more than the scoreline ever could. Alex broke serve right away, went up 2-0, the kind of lead that usually holds. Then she didn't win another game for the rest of the match. The hinge was the 5th game, and it didn't go quickly. Past 20 minutes, 13 deuces. Anisimova had 8 break points in that game alone, and couldn't convert one of them because Alex kept fighting them off until she somehow held serve. Then, Almost like whatever she'd spent defending that game never came back, she couldn't find another hold the rest of the way. That's what actually explains the collapse. Not a talent gap, not nerves in any obvious sense. A player who emptied the tank holding one game, with nothing left for the ones that followed. Now, the detail that never shows up in a box score. Through that same set, while all of this unfolded on court, the stands weren't behaving the way they had all week. Fewer flags. Quieter stretches. Anisimova brought it up herself afterward. Almost casually, she hadn't seen quite as much of Alex's crowd out there, and whatever support she did get gave her a boost through the tough stretches. Maybe the late start pulled fewer people in. Maybe there was more to it. Worth sitting with, because it's the real question here. A crowd this large, this consistent, documented across 3 different countries thinning out on the one night it mattered most. Does that mean nothing? Does it point to something closer to exhaustion, the kind that hit Alex herself in that 5th game, except spread across an entire fan base instead of one player? Or is there a completely different explanation nobody's landed on yet? Here's the version a lot of people have quietly settled on already. A tournament leaned hard into one player's popularity, changed its food, changed its ticket strategy, and now has to figure out what the rest of the week looks like without her. Meanwhile, a fan base that filled stadiums for months just had a night where it didn't show up the same way. Line those 2 facts up side by side, and it starts to look like the whole thing was riding on one 21-year-old's ability to keep winning matches. Tidy story. Fits the headline perfectly, almost certainly wrong. Because none of this actually ends in Cincinnati. It only looks that way if the story stops too early. Here's the piece. Nobody covering that quiet crowd seems to be putting together. Alex isn't finished for the summer, not even close. Within days of that loss, her next stop was already locked in. The US Open, and not only as a singles entry. She'd already picked up a wild card into mixed doubles alongside Felix Auger-Aliassime, plus an exhibition match against a rising player named Iva Jovic, scheduled right on Arthur Ashe during the tournament's opening week. That's not a footnote. That's the biggest stage in American tennis, and she's walking in with a guaranteed spotlight before her first real match even begins. Set that next to one more fact. New York City is home to roughly 94,000 people of Philippine descent. Not spread evenly across the boroughs, the heaviest concentration sits in Queens, which happens to be exactly where the US Open is played. Let that sink in for a second. The same community that packed Toronto, the one that broke records in Cincinnati. Its largest concentration anywhere in the country sits a subway ride away from the exact courts Alex is about to walk onto. Suddenly, that quiet night against Anisimova looks less like a fan base losing interest and more like a tide pulling back right before it hits a much bigger shoreline. Tides don't vanish when they recede, they're gathering for the next break. And the next break, in this case, happens to be the loudest stage American tennis has to offer. Which brings up the question Cincinnati never actually answered. Was that quiet crowd a warning sign that this whole phenomenon has a ceiling? Or was it simply the calm before something far louder than anything we've seen from her yet? If you know Queens, or how deep that community runs there, say so below. Because whatever happens at Arthur Ashe is about to answer something this entire summer has been building toward. So if this isn't a fan base fading out, what does the full pattern actually look like once every piece is on the table? Toronto started it. That second-round match sold out inside hours, not as some isolated scramble, but echoing what had already happened weeks earlier in Austria, where a modest event turned into rows of traveling supporters nobody quite expected. Then came Cincinnati, and rather than those numbers cooling off the way you'd guess after 2 smaller stops, they smashed a record that had stood for years. 3 cities, 3 continents worth of travel logistics, once you actually think about how far some of these fans went for a few hours of tennis. And in every case, the shape repeats almost exactly. Tickets vanish fast, flags appear before the first ball is struck, vendors rework their menus. Coincidence doesn't happen 3 times running. What's showing up instead is a fan base large and consistent enough that tournaments are planning around it before the draw is even finalized. Now hold New York up against all of that. 94,000 people of Philippine descent, concentrated most heavily in Queens again, precisely where the US Open takes place. Toronto has one of the largest Filipino populations in Canada, which explains a lot of why that crowd got as loud as it did. Even that number doesn't come close to what's waiting in Queens, though. This isn't a fan base discovering a new city. It's a fan base walking straight into the one place built to hold the biggest version of itself. Against that backdrop, the quiet night against Anisimova shrinks fast. One late match. One dip in numbers after an entire summer of records. Not a trend, a single data point mistaken for a turning point, mostly because it landed right, when everyone was already scanning for cracks. Here's what actually deserves the attention, though. This isn't just another stop for Alex. It's the first Grand Slam she'll play since any of this started. Everything before now, Austria, Toronto, Cincinnati, happened a level or two below where she's headed next. The US Open runs on a different scale entirely. More cameras, more coverage, and now, for the first time, a hometown crowd this size finally gets a shot at a major stage. Nobody's seen that combination yet. Which means nobody actually knows what it looks like once it happens. So, here's where this lands. Alex Eala didn't leave Cincinnati broken. And she didn't leave because the story around her had run dry. She left because a bigger chapter was already booked. A wild card into mixed doubles. An exhibition on Arthur Ashe before her first real match even starts. And a crowd in Queens that's been building toward this exact moment longer than most people realize. That quiet night against Anisimova wasn't the ending it looked like at the time. It was a breath, one pause before the loudest room she's ever stepped into. Whether that turns into something bigger than Toronto, bigger than Cincinnati, nobody can promise yet. Grand Slam pressure plays by its own rules, and a loud crowd doesn't always translate to a good result on the scoreboard. But judging by everything this summer has shown so far, the version of this story that ends in Cincinnati was never the real one. The real one starts at Arthur Ashe. If you're going, or you already know someone who is, drop it below because whatever comes next is about to settle the one question this whole summer never quite answered.